And hello and welcome everybody, wherever you are. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, and welcome to what is the second in the IORA Blue Carbon Hub webinar series. And today we're talking a little bit about blue forest finance, and I would like to introduce our moderator so that I can step aside. I would like to introduce Cheryl Rita Kaur from the Centre for Coastal and Marine Environment at the Maritime Institute of Malaysia. And Cheryl's doing us the honour of moderating the webinar today, introducing the speakers and keeping us all in line. And Cheryl will tell you the running order of how we're running it today. So over to you, Cheryl.
Thank you very much, Matt. A very good, I would say a good day to all of you. We are all in different time zones at the moment. Thank you very much, Matt. And I appreciate the opportunity to moderate this, I must say, an excellent lineup of panel speakers we have with us today for this virtual webinar hosted by the IORA Blue Carbon Hub in collaboration with the IORA Secretariat, focusing on a sustainable blue forest economy. I think it is an area that's not alien to most of us, I must say. It's a very topical area. And as a brief introduction, perhaps, to some of the attendees in this forum today, I'll just say we believe more than ever the protection and restoration of coastal habitats offers an opportunity in mitigating multiple challenges that we're facing, especially in coastal protection and food security for some of the communities, especially the coastal communities in this region, in IORA region, and in many places around the world. Coastal ecosystems, such as, especially when we talk about mangroves, tidal marshes, and seagrasses, they're very, very important in the sense of the carbon sequestration. In comparison, most of the time, we always compare this ecosystem to the terrestrial forests and their role in mitigating climate change, as well as in climate change adaptation, has been widely recognized and spoken about and discussed at many different forums. And we believe that if these ecosystems are degraded or damaged, the carbon sink capacity will be lost and adversely affected. And hence, dedicated conservation efforts has been promoted in many parts of the world, including from where I speak now in Malaysia as well, where we're talking about protecting the coastal ecosystem to ensure that they play their role in long-term carbon sinks. For that, we believe that it is enormously crucial to look into harnessing the joint potential of the public and private sectors to address the finance need, while also creating jobs and opportunities for livelihoods, generating new sustainable pathways to rebuild economies, as well as to recover from what we all face at the moment, the global coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic, and the effects that we have all had to address. Considering all this, today's webinar will delve into some of these current and promising mechanisms. We have with us 4 speakers who will all address the different aspects of the objective that we have set for this webinar today. And each of the speakers will be given about 12 minutes for the presentation. And we hope that all of you will be able to keep to that time so that we can have at least an opportunity for Q&A and discussion at the end about, let's go for about 30 minutes after the presentation. So I would encourage all the participants to, we will have the discussion at the end of all the 4 presentations, but I encourage you to drop your questions, comments, and so on in the Q&A function that is below your screen. So without further ado, I'd like to invite now the first presenter, Matt, and I'll just briefly introduce you. Matt is currently a scientist with CSIRO Oceans and Atmosphere. He's also the director of the IORA Blue Carbon Hub and has been mostly working on blue carbon. In fact, I've known Matt for the last couple of years, and we've always been meeting at similar forums, especially on blue carbon. So Matt, I pass the floor to you.
Apologies, I'm just sorting out my audio there and back to my screen share. So thank you, Cheryl. Indeed, we have multiple occasions where we've been able to have good chats together at various events over the years, and those chats are generally focused around something like this, about the sorts of solutions that we can use nature to generate to help combat some of the world's problems. So that's what we're going to talk about today, something that we're calling blue forest solutions. So if I start with just a brief overview of what we're about in the IORA Blue Carbon Hub, it was launched a little over 18 months ago in Bangladesh. And since then, we've been able to run a few different types of activities, including some fellowships where we've had the pleasure of some young professionals or early career professionals that we've been able to work with, and then something that we call think tanks, pop-up think tanks, where we focus in on some of the problems that we think are worth collectively thinking about and trying to address. And the first one of those that we held was on blue carbon or blue forest finance. And we held that in Mauritius almost exactly a year ago, before borders started to close and travel started to get a little bit tricky. And in Mauritius, we convened representatives from around the Indian Ocean, from IORA member states and dialogue partners, and we wanted to discuss the role of finance in achieving these blue forest solutions. And we were focused on finance because we define it as the incentive structure that we need to achieve the goals and the sort of the architecture that we can start building in order to implement some of these solutions. But one of the things that we discussed in that workshop was that finance can be confusing as a concept. And so we wanted to try and demystify that. But perhaps before we launch into finance, I'll step back and talk very broadly about the sorts of things we're talking about. Generally, we're talking about these plant-dominated coastal ecosystems, what we call blue carbon ecosystems, or as Stephen Lutz at the workshop proposed, that we're calling them blue forests or blue meadows, perhaps, if we're thinking about seagrasses. And these are particularly useful as nature-based solutions. Lauren's going to explode this and delve into it perhaps a little bit deeper, but I've kind of collapsed it into three things that we're thinking about from the hub perspective. One is around livelihoods, and we think about things like the food that these ecosystems provide through fisheries and aquaculture, through tourism opportunities and ecotourism sort of based livelihoods. They punch above their weight in terms of their contribution to potential climate mitigation solutions, as Cheryl's mentioned in her introductory comments. And they can also help in terms of reducing the risk of disasters, especially those kind of storm disasters that lead to damaging waves coming in off the ocean. And we think broadly about protection and restoration of, we're already losing these ecosystems at quite a rate, so perhaps let's not do that. And then can we start rebuilding those ecosystems and try and get the benefits of them back? And in doing that, we know that the Indian Ocean is particularly important. So a little bit of a desktop analysis we've done suggests that IORA nations combined have almost half of the world's mangroves, for example, and that's great. That's a wonderful resource and asset for IORA nations to have, but there is a little bit of a problem because the same nations that have almost half of the world's mangroves are unfortunately losing it at greater rates, such that around about 2/3 of the world's mangrove loss over the last few decades has also occurred in those same nations. So we've got a great asset, but also a bit of a problem that we want to resolve so that we can harness the solutions that those ecosystems offer. And we were sort of traveling reasonably well in terms of our thinking. And then all of a sudden, as also Cheryl mentioned, we hit a bit of a bump in terms of the COVID pandemic, which has, of course, had many, many tragic consequences, and has had other consequences in terms of its economic impact. And that has flow-on effects to sort of the ability to finance different activities, but we're trying to flip it on its head and think about, well, how can investment into these solutions help resolve some of the problems so that actually it contributes to post-COVID economic growth, as well as solve those problems around climate, livelihoods, disaster, and so on. At the workshop, we started, developing a bit of a classification of how we might like to think about it. And one idea is to look at it like this. And we often sometimes think about donor-based finance, such that we think about it as grants, money that is given perhaps with not an explicit expectation of a financial return. But then there's this whole class of investment which is given with an expectation of some return. And we tend to call that investment. And there's a bunch of different formats that this can take, and some of those will be drilled into today by some of the speakers. For example, and Lauren will certainly cover that in terms of the broad spectrum of the possibilities and the sort of the appetite for them and the barriers that might be there that we need to overcome. Some of the methods will be familiar to people, things like payments and loans, the sort of, you spend some money to get something back, and carbon markets fit a little bit into that. And Leah is going to give us some example of how carbon markets are being used in Madagascar. There are other types of models which are perhaps a little bit complex, perhaps a little bit broader in scope, things like bonds and trust funds and ways of generating very large scale investment and managing that investment. And Angelique will give us some examples of how that's being done very nicely in Seychelles. There is a class of investment that's around risk transfer, things about, think about insurance, which is an intuitive concept to many, is that we can spend money in order to not have spend money now and in increments in order to not have to spend money or cost money down the track a little bit. So those are worth thinking about. They're not very well developed in the Indian Ocean area. So in fact, when I started to think about what is being used in the Indian Ocean context, I came up with something that looks a little bit like this, such that blue carbon markets are slowly being rolled out. They've taken a little while to get some traction, but they are slowly being rolled out such that there are sort of a few examples now around the Indian Ocean and some consideration of them in some of the domestic schemes in places like Australia and South Africa. The blue bonds and the trust funds, there's again an excellent example from the Indian Ocean region based in Seychelles that we're going to hear about. There are others in the region, for example, in Philippines, there's an insurance model that's being developed around mangroves. So there are a few things being developed, but we're really at the start of this journey. And that's what we're all about today. That's what we talked about at the first of our think tank meetings in Mauritius, and we're developing some of the outputs from that we will be releasing to the public this year, we hope. And so with that, I'm going to hand back to Cheryl and just note that if you do want some resources, you can pop onto this website and you can find a whole raft of resources about the sorts of things that we're talking about today. But with that, back to you, Cheryl, and back to the excellent lineup of speakers that we have.
Thank you very much, Matt, also for keeping well within the 12 minutes time, so that will give us a bit more time for discussion. Thank you so much for the very informative presentation, Matt. As I mentioned earlier, we'll keep the questions. I've seen one question in the Q&A function, but we'll keep it to the end of the 4 presentations, and we'll take it then. Let's move on to the second presenter. Let me introduce you to Lauren. Lauren Drake is the director at Pollination, a specialized climate change advisory and investment firm focused on accelerating the transition to a net zero climate resilient future. Very, very relevant indeed. Lauren's background is in climate law and policy, with a particular focus on carbon markets and nature-based solutions. And she has advised carbon offset buyers and project developers, including blue carbon projects, on a range of issues, including legal, policy, and strategic issues. Lauren, in her presentation, will be discussing on the investor and finance perspective. So, Lauren, with that, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Let me just get my screen share working. Okay, you should be able to see that, I think. So thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Cheryl, and thanks, Matt, for setting the scene a bit more as well. I guess my perspective today will be thinking about blue carbon and you know, obviously blue forest finance, which I also really like, as a investable opportunity, and thinking about the projects that exist in the market from that lens. A bit about what I know and what my experience has been of some of the barriers to investment, and then also thinking about some of the solutions to that, which I think, you know, Matt has definitely set the scene really well for that, and thinking about the types of finance options out there. But hopefully I can dig in a little bit more to some of those in light of the investment barriers that I've come across. So just to start, I think I wanted to set the scene a bit about the carbon market globally, because we really are at a point where over the past 18 months, what we've seen at Pollination, and you know, others obviously around the world are looking at this really closely at the moment, and you know, it's encouraging to see that despite all the terrible impacts of COVID, there has been a real resurgence from our perspective in interest in carbon markets globally. I think that there's been a big escalation in the rate that governments, investors and companies are committing to net zero and increasingly negative emissions profiles, increasingly with respect to scope 3, and you know, with targets around 2050 and other countries 2060. And so what we're seeing is, you know, in countries implementing compliance carbon schemes, and then in addition, voluntary carbon market demand increasing. I think, you know, there are a lot of numbers out there. One of them is that it increased 49% between 2016 and 2018. And in the past 18 months, I think that's been even larger. But with that in mind, what we're also seeing is that the supply of high quality credits is quite constrained compared to this demand. And these supply issues will become more pronounced in the short term, with a projected decline in the availability of carbon offsets from renewable energy projects, which are going to be no longer additional in some countries under some of the standards, and demand under some schemes such as CORSIA will also cause some constraints in the post-2020 volumes. So the development of new methodologies will assist with these supply shortages, and so that's where the focus and anticipation of blue carbon projects coming online, I think, has got a lot of attention from investors, because of the, you know, the high volumes of carbon that can be generated from smaller sites. And we'll put my colleagues on the spot, my fellow panelists, to talk a bit more about that later on. So this graph, I won't go into too much detail, but it's one of the, it's a recent indication of some of the demand projections. And so one of them is the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, which anticipates a 15-fold increase up to 2030, and other scenarios from the Network for Greening the Financial System. So that's just an indication of the demand. This graph, and we thank to colleagues at CI for preparing this, is I thought a really good indication of, you know, within this emerging demand, that there is a strong appetite for high quality credits. And if we can use the climate, community and biodiversity standard as an indication for that, which is, you know, the credits that are certified by the by VERA that have, you know, those additional climate, community and biodiversity co-benefits, I think that's a good indication of that companies particularly are really seeing value in those additional social and environmental benefits from carbon. And bringing it back to blue carbon, what we know, and Matt's already touched on this, thanks Matt, about, you know, the really strong co-benefits provided by these blue carbon projects. And, you know, so beyond being a carbon sink, we have coastal resilience, food security, water filtration, biodiversity, tourism and recreation, social and cultural benefits, and local livelihoods. And what we're seeing from the investor perspective is that investors are increasingly seeing these co-benefits as being an opportunity to create new value from their investments. And, you know, and one way to do this is to stack together the co-benefits, and there's emerging sort of regimes around how you might do that, and in what format. But whatever format it takes, you know, whether it is by having a different credit on top of a carbon credit, and we're seeing that, for example, the VERA has a coastal resilience methodology now as well, or whether it's sort of co-benefits embedded in a credit, what we're seeing is that the private sector is really increasingly aware of that. And I think that's driven by a number of factors, including the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures is really, I think, increasing awareness about biodiversity and nature loss issues, which is leading to a strong preference to investing in biodiversity outcomes. And you know, I think as companies are becoming more sophisticated in their dealing with carbon markets, they're seeing ways that carbon credits can allow them to achieve other business objectives. For example, around cultural benefits, and in Australia we have companies that pursue reconciliation action plans, and so investing in projects with strong cultural benefits can be seen as achieving those dual goals. So I think, yeah, it's pretty clear that blue carbon does offer those additional benefits, and so that's where a lot of the appetite lies to be able to invest in them. So digging in a little bit, and there's a lot of text on here, and so I won't go into too much detail, but some of the, and I think some of the lessons here are, or the challenges here that we've come across are probably more Australia focused, and I'm keen for other panelists to give their views. But what we're finding a little bit in Australia, and maybe that's because we're slightly behind in the sense that our carbon farming scheme here is still in the process of developing a blue carbon methodology. So a lot of the scientists are very presently tackling some of the issues around measurement and thinking through which methodology is particularly suitable to our ecosystems, and, you know, and the costs of measuring those and establishing baselines, issues around including carbon in sediments as well as plant matter, and, you know, making sure that we use a method that is able to account for as much carbon as possible while being scientifically robust, are some of the issues around measurement and baselines. On top of that, there are double counting issues at, you know, both the domestic and international scale. So we're, like, for example, in Australia, that there are, you know, there's potential, I think, for some of the voluntary carbon standards to be used, but then the double counting issues need to be taken into account. And I think, and that might be the case in other countries as well, as they do develop their own domestic offset schemes. And then in addition, there's continued ambiguity around Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and how the issues of corresponding adjustments will play out, both in terms of voluntary carbon markets as well as compliance-based markets and for meeting NDCs. So there's some of the sort of accounting-based challenges. In terms of some of the challenges particular to an investor's perspective, I mean, I guess, yeah, the accounting challenges will really be the ones that a project will look at when they're looking to get off the ground. An investor will, of course, be interested in those, but will, I think, in my experience, largely rely on the particular standard that's being used to deal with those issues, but they will increasingly focus on some of these challenges of a project when they're assessing whether to invest in any particular project at a time. So, for example, some of the land tenure issues can be difficult in this space because coastal areas are often owned by multiple landholders. There are also emerging issues arising in the context of sea level rise because those areas of the coast may then essentially become under the jurisdiction of the government in some instances because they're part of the ocean, which can be difficult to manage when you're thinking about a long-term project. And then sort of, yeah, some of the market context, including the need for a scale to make projects sufficiently economically viable. And we've looked at instances where there's, such huge potential at a small scale, but to be able to make it economically viable, they do need to be scaled up sometimes. So, conscious I've only got a couple of minutes left to whiz through. I thought this is a really interesting study done by Earth Security that assesses the break-even cost of running a blue carbon project, and this is globally, and so it's not specific to the IORA region or any particular country, and doesn't take into account the particular context of a project, which I think is an important caveat, because we know that each project has different costs, if it's restoration or conservation or, particular land tenure arrangements, ease of access, cost of labour, cost of technology. But I think it's just interesting to note what they've modelled is that there's a break-even price of the US $29 for global scale mangrove restoration. So that would need to be the carbon price to get things off the ground. And so with that in mind, and there are all sorts of projections around where the carbon price is going, but I think thinking about it currently, that carbon price to finance these projects would need to in some way value the premium of these co-benefits in order to get these projects to make them viable. And I think that's desired as well by the market in terms of being able to measure and monitor those co-benefits is an important aspect that I've already talked about, but then making them part of the value to justify that price will likely be important for future projects. I might skip through a little bit, and yeah, and Matt really also introduced some of these finance concepts, but I just wanted to raise them again here and show that there's likely going to be a role for both governments, private sector, philanthropy to get involved with some of the mechanisms that could solve some of those investability challenges and allow blue carbon projects to be implemented at scale. And some of these mechanisms already exist, and I think Angelique will be able to give a few examples from her experience as well, and that there are many lessons to be learned from the ones already, but I think it'll be really exciting to see how some of these play out to get new projects off the ground in future as well. One final point I did want to raise, which is just a fascinating area, and I think something that hopefully will get more attention, and when we're thinking about financing projects, is thinking about the whole value chain of blue carbon and ways to potentially add revenue streams to the projects by valuing some of the products that can be created through the ocean economy and the blue carbon ecosystem. And so some examples of that are kelp, which Kelp Blue I'm aware of is a company that is developing a whole business around agri-feed supplements. We know in Australia there's a lot of talk about asparagopsis as a methane inhibitor, and there are examples of seaweed being used in medicinal products and stuff. So I'm keen for the other panelists to weigh in on that too, but I find it a fascinating emerging area and a way to add the value potentially to some of these projects and make them more economically viable. That's it for me. Sorry, I used the gift of Matt's extra time.
Thank you, Lauren. No, it was not that far off from the allocated time. Thank you so much for the very interesting presentation, Lauren, especially on the investor and finance perspective that you've given on blue carbon. I picked a couple of interesting points actually, and one of those includes the different challenges that you spoke about on implementing this, including accounting challenges, financing, legal, policy challenges. So there's quite a bit that we need to address, especially so if you're talking about the IORA region. So thank you so much, Lauren, for the presentation. I take this opportunity to again encourage the participants to post questions that you have in the Q&A function below your screen, and we will take it up after the rest of the two presentations are completed. Let's move on to the next presenter. We have with us Angelique as the next speaker. She is the CEO of the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust. Angelique is a lawyer and she holds LLM in environmental law, specializing in the law of the sea and natural resources law. She's also trained as a climate change negotiator under the, correct me if I'm wrong, AOSIS, if that's how we pronounce it, AOSIS, Climate Change Fellowship Program at the United Nations. She will be discussing today the various blended finance models that are being used, especially in the Seychelles, to ensure the sustainable flows of finance to protected areas. With that, Angelique, over to you.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, for that introduction. Let me just share my screen. Okay. I hope that's working for everyone. So greetings everyone from the Seychelles, and indeed, as panelists who have come before me have said, I will be sharing about the experiences of the Seychelles, mostly as it relates to the trust fund model that we currently have, and it was set up as a result of a debt for nature swap, and then grew to also support the Seychelles Sovereign Blue Bond. So I won't go into too many technicalities. 12 minutes is simply insufficient to go into the nitty-gritty of the deals, but I hope it will give you an overview of the different models that we have. I'll also be sharing with you an ongoing project that we currently have in the Seychelles as it relates to seagrass meadows and the integration of blue carbon habitats into our nationally determined contribution, and the fact that we are looking to see what are the opportunities or potential for blue carbon financing, and the previous speaker has obviously set out, all the challenges and that we would need to think about, which is very helpful. I've taken a screenshot, and for us to be able to see how to move that to a reality. So SeyCCAT, and here is I'll allow the diagram to sort of sit and let it play out. So what you're looking at is really the financial deal that allowed for the debt for nature swap. And here we find that, allow it to go, and there we are, and then the blue bond begins. So what this, although a very technical diagram, I think for purposes of today, I think it's worth showing that this was a deal. It was quite complex, but at the same time, it involved a debt restructure and a debt buyback of the public debt of the government of Seychelles. And this was facilitated and assisted by the Nature Conservancy. in partnership with the government of Seychelles, where they were able to buy back the Seychelles was able to buy back its debt from sovereign creditors at the Paris Club. However, there were certain conditions to this deal. One of the conditions was to protect 30% of our exclusive economic zone, a commitment to continue financing conservation, climate adaptation, and blue economy projects. But one of the things that was put in place in order to facilitate this deal was a SeyCCAT, the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust, this independent trust fund that would enable the deal to take place. So as you can see from this diagram, SeyCCATs, perhaps we're biased, but we sit in the middle of it all, where we make sure that our impact investors are repaid in terms of the loan repayment from the government of Seychelles to the Nature Conservancy. We also make sure that the commitment to protect 30% is being undertaken by the government. So we do have a close partnership with the Marine Spatial Planning Initiative. And it's worth saying and mentioning that, of course, the Seychelles has been successful in legally designating 30% of its exclusive economic zone as at March 2020. So that's one of the conditions. The other condition was, of course, the supporting of conservation, climate adaptation, and blue economy projects. And this is facilitated through SeyCCAT's Blue Grants Fund. And you will see that sort of at the bottom of the screen, where every year we manage a fund which is capitalized by the debt swap, but also by the blue bond, and I'll go to the bond next. But in addition to that, this is meant to be a long-term deal, even though the debt for nature swap transaction is for a period of 20 years. What we do find is we have an endowment fund, and this is where every year we capitalize it. We also have an investment strategy where we invest the funds, and it is set to mature in 2036, where we will now be given a new amount of money for us to support SeyCCAT as well as the Blue Grants Fund, and support local communities to have access to finance to implement these projects. So these are the sort of the core three elements that SeyCCAT takes care of. And I will move to the diagram about the blue bond. I know the debt swap is numbers flying around and arrows, but happy to sit down at another time to really go through the nitty-gritty of these transactions. So I just thought I'd elaborate a little bit more on the debt swap in terms of what were the benefits. And here we have over 400,000 square kilometers of marine protected areas. 50% is no-take zones for these high biodiversity areas, and the other 50% are sustainable use areas. We also now have a marine spatial plan policy. We have $8.6 million as a result of the transaction to support marine and climate adaptation work. I've pointed to that with regards to the Blue Grants Fund, and we also have an endowment. So really thinking long-term and sort of future generation thinking with regards to the endowment. Then came the blue bond, and this goes to the strength of the trust fund model. SeyCCAT at the time was originally created for the purposes of the debt for nature swap. But because of its competitive advantage with regards to being an independent body, it was autonomous. Our board has representation from public, private, and civil society. It became an attractive vehicle to also manage other grants that were emerging. So here we have one such example, the Seychelles Sovereign Blue Bond, where the government of Seychelles issued a sovereign bond. They were able to raise $15 million with investors as you see, Calvert Impact Capital, Noveen, and Prudential. And with this, and again, Here we see private capital coming in, a sovereign bond, but there are certain conditions. And, you know, all these are sustainability targets that are put in place. And for the blue bond, it was essential that there is the funds, the proceeds are used towards sustainable fisheries. So this would be administered in two different pots. $3 million would go to the Blue Grants Fund, which is what sits with SeyCCAT, and $12 million would go to the Blue Investment Fund to go as loans and to be administered by the Development Bank of Seychelles. This sovereign blue bond, again, I won't go into the technicalities and the specifics of it, but also worth mentioning that it is supported by a World Bank partial guarantee, as well as a concessional loan from the Global Environment Facility. But going back to the topic of the bond, the debt swap, and the trust fund, one of the things that we've seen over time, and we recently celebrated 5 years, is the trust fund model is a model that that has a competitive advantage and attracts more funding. So what we find is when donors approach the government of Seychelles, and many of them have internal revenue controls that don't allow them to provide funding directly to government, government is always assured that it has a financing partner that it can direct donors to, and who can work with them to really develop projects that are useful for the Seychelles. And they know they have a trust fund that has experience in grants management and project management and a reputation in delivering impact. So this is something else that we've seen through the growth of SeyCCAT, that it's become a model that a lot of donors come to. So maybe just a little bit about SeyCCAT itself, and I've already spoken to the first 2 points as the sort of the manager of the debt swap and the blue bond, but it is an independent trust fund. The co-founders of the trust are the Nature Conservancy and the government of Seychelles, but on the basis that it will be independent, it will work independently of them. It was legally established under its own Act of Parliament. We have our board of directors, again, representatives from private sector as well as public sector and civil society. I've already spoken to our core work with regards to the debt swap and also with regards to funding projects linked to ocean conservation, climate adaptation, and blue economy. So this is a little bit more about the trust fund. So all in all, debt swap as well as the blue bond, we find that we have $700,000 annually available as grants. 200,000 comes from the debt for nature swap. 500,000 comes from the blue bond. Together, every year, we're able to offer $700,000 as grants to local communities in Seychelles. As already mentioned, we do have the $12 million as loans that is administered by the Development Bank of Seychelles. And it's worth saying that because of the inflow of other grants, we are able to support other activities, even though it's not administered through our Blue Grants Fund. Very conscious of time and won't go too much into this. These are our strategic objectives, but I will go swiftly to the blue carbon piece in a moment. But what type of projects do we fund? At the moment, we have several. We have a portfolio of 39 projects that have been funded by the Blue Grants Fund, roadmap to blue carbon opportunities in Seychelles, again, through partnerships with Deakin University, for example, river mapping and monitoring of mangrove habitats on one of the second biggest island. We're doing mapping of coral population and connectivity within the Indian Ocean, and we're also investing in education and awareness on various topics, including climate change. So now moving to the blue carbon piece, or specifically the project that we're currently funding, where we're currently managing, and it's being supported by a whole host of partners, including the Pew Charitable Trust, the Nature Conservancy, the Government of Seychelles, the University of Seychelles, the University of Oxford. We have a whole host of partners on this. But just to share with you a bit of what we're planning to do. So this is a project that will be able to understand the extent of seagrass meadows in the Seychelles across its entire EEZ. And this will serve as a scientific baseline for policymakers to include seagrass protections within the Seychelles' nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement. We will start with mapping seagrass through remote sensory, so with satellite imagery. That is the first step, and we have some aerospace agencies that will be supporting that. And then this will be followed by field data collection of the seagrass meadows. Researchers will go around the entire EZ, and we've identified the sites that are most relevant. The data will then be analyzed to estimate the seagrass extent as well as carbon stock. And it will be used to generate a first-time estimate of carbon stock for seagrass meadows in the country. And finally, the scientific information will inform policy decisions with regards to protections as well as NDCs. And worth noting that alongside this work, we are thinking of generating a blue carbon financing piece, which we are currently working on. But I think I'll bring this all together to say that when it comes to blue carbon ecosystems or blue forests and marine protection, there is a huge, significant financing gap that requires a buffet of options. Seychelles is clearly testing out several options, and there may be an opportunity to mix and match and see how to bring a multitude of these options to have the best output. And we are definitely looking at seagrass, yes, from this ecosystem service with regards to climate change, but also, as already mentioned, looking at biodiversity value, given its link to turtles, for example, in our tourism industry, as well as fisheries for small scale fishers in particular. So a lot going on, but still a lot to think about into how to realize other blue carbon finance or new blue carbon financing opportunities that will complement existing opportunities within the Seychelles. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angelique. I think it was an excellent case for a country level finance model where you presented on, the different financial aspects or how the investors and government are coming together to collaborate in terms of, addressing blue carbon financial needs, including blue grants, blue bonds, as well as to the extent of how this finance is being used for projects specifically. And you mentioned there's been more than 30 projects now, which is an excellent example. I think it will be a very useful case for other countries in the IORA region to perhaps emulate, or if not adopt and adapt to the situation at the country level. So with that, thank you very much, Angelique, for the excellent presentation. We now will move to the last but not least presenter. Leah will be the next and our final presenter for this forum. Leah is a technical advisor for Blue Ventures Mangrove and Blue Carbon work. She's a technical advisor, and for the last 8 years, she's been working with coastal communities in Madagascar to develop mangrove blue carbon projects, which support sustainable marine management there. And today she will be talking about how, if certain barriers are overcome, climate finance particularly and carbon markets can support both climate change mitigation and adaptation at scale. A very pertinent area to speak about for sure. Leah, over to you.
Thanks, Cheryl. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here today, and thank you to the IORA Secretariat and Matt and everyone at CSIRO for convening this really interesting session. I hope my internet holds out. Matt is very kindly sharing a screen. It's a real pleasure to join you today from Madagascar, where I've been lucky enough to call home for the last 8 years, working with Blue Ventures. And today, I'm just going to give a quick overview of blue carbon offset projects and some of the potential sustainable long-term financing for blue carbon habitat management and also marine management more broadly. Thanks, Matt. You can move on to the next slide. So just very quickly, some of this has already been covered by previous presentations, particularly Matt's. But yeah, as we all know, coastal wetlands, mangroves, seagrasses, tidal marshes are incredibly carbon-rich ecosystems, and entities that protect or restore them result in a CO2 impact, so a climate impact. If initiatives or groups or governments or projects can quantify this impact, there's a potential to sell carbon credits on the voluntary or some national compliance markets in order to raise finance for conservation and restoration of these habitats, but also potentially for marine conservation more broadly. Thanks, Matt. So Lauren, in a really excellent presentation, kind of went over this a little bit as well, but these pathways to carbon finance can look differently depending on what scale they're done at. There are national initiatives such as REDD+, which mangroves can be included under in some scenarios, and also certain national compliance schemes. And then there's the project scale for offset sales on the voluntary carbon market. In order to be able to sell credits to people interested in verified credits, projects need to validate and verify their project and the emissions under a standard, a third-party standard. There are not a huge number of options for blue carbon projects at the moment. The two main ones are the verified carbon standard, which could be paired with the CCB standard, which Lauren mentioned. And there's also the smaller scale, more community focused Plan Vivo standard. The last potential route is a kind of here called it unverified, but we're seeing an increasing number of opportunities for projects to raise funds through like normally tree planting campaigns where, you know, they don't verify their credits with a third party standard, but they still report their carbon impact and raise funds like that. So these are kind of the three major ways to raise funds for blue carbon offset projects. Next slide, please, Matt. So why am I talking about this? Who do I work for? So I work for Blue Ventures. We're a marine conservation organization really focused on developing initiatives that make marine management make sense for coastal people across the tropics. We work in either directly in or with partners in 12 countries across the tropics. And as I said, we're really looking to develop approaches which make marine conservation make sense for coastal communities. Blue carbon's been a really important part of our adventure over the last 10 years. And yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing some of the lessons and stuff that we've learned over that time. The next slide, thanks, Matt, just gives a quick overview of why we as a marine conservation organization are interested in blue carbon. So we see it as a potential for funding and also adding an incentive for locally led mangrove management. It's been our focus initially, but also as a funding mechanism for the broader fisheries management. We all know that these systems don't exist in isolation. Sorry. Second, having some issues with my screen. Don't exist in isolation, and there is the potential for blue carbon offset income to also fund sustainable fisheries management and improve livelihoods that can assist sustainable blue growth in coastal regions. Coastal communities are already receiving many benefits from mangroves, including fisheries and storm protection, which has been spoken about before. But this carbon locked up in the biomass and soils is really kind of like an unrealized value, which, if unlocked, could provide long-term financing for management and increasing the well-being of coastal communities. Thanks, Matt. It's also a fairly robust way in carbon projects require voluntary carbon market. It requires projects to and initiatives to think about things like leakage. So where might the deforestation drivers move? If this area of mangroves or seagrasses or salt marshes were to be preserved, it's also relatively, it can be set up properly, a really transparent and quantifiable way to bring finance to marine management, in the fact that the impact of the conservation or restoration is clearly quantified, and payments are based on the success of that conservation. Thanks, Matt. Looking more broadly, kind of like zooming out a little bit as well, these projects can exist at a variety of different scales. They can be very small scale, 100, 1,000, 2,000 hectares. They can be multi-thousand hectares, and they can also be national scale. And carbon finance really has the potential, because it's linked to sustainable mangrove or blue carbon management. It has the potential to be a funding mechanism for a really climate-friendly blue growth post-COVID, and the challenges that almost every country now. And of critical importance is, as well as mitigation, it really helps support climate adaptation along the coast, where some of the most vulnerable communities and people to the global climate emergency are based. Thanks, Matt. So just to give a very quick overview of some of the work that Blue Ventures has done. So we've been, over the last 10 years, developing 2 projects in Madagascar, one in the southwest and one in the northwest. You can just keep on scrolling, Matt. These carbon projects, they're underpinned by management plans developed by coastal communities. They include both conservation, mangrove conservation and restoration, and of real critical importance to us. Integrated into those management plans are fisheries management to ensure complete integrated marine management, and also the support for alternative initiatives, which are very much needed in many remote parts of Madagascar. The project in the southwest is a small scale. It's called the Hunku project, and it's been validated under the Plan Vivo standard. And we've also been looking at the feasibility of a verified carbon standard project in the northwest, covering a 7,000 hectare area. And with the release of the BCS Blue Carbon Conservation methodology last year, we're really excited to continue that journey. Thanks, Matt. And yeah, so really just kind of highlighting that the projects are really designed from the bottom up, underpinned by local management plans and designed by the activities which result in the emission reduction and removals are designed by the communities themselves. In order to enable us to take these projects to market, we've completed carbon measures data is also fed into the Madagascar's National RED program, which really excitedly includes mangroves. Thanks, Matt. And we've been also working with partners and other groups to try and create simple and replicable protocols for both measuring the carbon and also taking projects to market, and really focusing on providing some default values that could be used by projects elsewhere within the Western Indian Ocean. And my wonderful colleagues here in Madagascar have also invested a huge amount of time and energy into training community monitors, so they're able to monitor the emission reductions themselves. Thanks, Matt. Where does the carbon finance, how does it get used? It gets used, it helps to cover some of the costs related to MPA governance and project activity implementation. It can also be used for social welfare projects, which increase the well-being of coastal communities. Also, a portion of the finances also go to the national to financially support their involvement in the project. And the finance mechanism is aligned with the national REDD+ framework in Madagascar. Thanks, Matt. So we remain really excited about blue carbon, but over the last 10 years, it has been a long journey for us. We've learned a lot on the way, and we've hit various challenges and barriers. Some of them we've managed to get through. For instance, the science has moved along a lot, thanks to a lot of the research that's going on within countries themselves and at universities around the world. But there are still some challenges which are really kind of like preventing blue carbon offset projects reaching their potential. The first one is complex methodologies. Some of the best conservation work is done by smaller groups on the ground, have the most permanence in the region, and the methodologies that are required to access, particularly the verified carbon standard, are quite complex and quite a large barrier for these groups to get through in order to be able to market their project. It's really important that these methodologies ensure that carbon impact is actually happening. You know, as we need robust emission reductions going forward. But there are certainly, hopefully, ways to make these methodologies a little bit more accessible and less complex. For us, one of the major challenges has really been policy uncertainty. Our project is developed alongside Madagascar's National REDD+ project, which has resulted in a relatively movable, dynamic policy context, which the project has had to adapt with as that's been done. Hopefully, as these kind of national initiatives reach maturity, this will become less of an issue, but at the moment it's certainly a challenge. And there's obviously, of course, the ongoing discussions around Article 6 related to the Paris Agreement. I'll go into that a little bit more shortly. Thanks, Matt. The financial viability and risk, this can be hard to assess, largely often because it's a market-based mechanism. Prices at the moment aren't guaranteed. It can be hard for projects to ascertain what is the financial risk associated with these projects, and also that it is still questionable about how scalable this is. Blue carbon has been a topic on the agenda for many years now, but there are still only a few projects in operation. There are a lot more in the pipeline, which is really, really exciting. But I do think its scalability is still in question. And the last one, Matt, thank you. And again, this risk, the methodologies and the protocols that countries or projects have to follow in order to access carbon finance is often very focused on the risk to the emission reductions. How can those risks be minimized? CCB does a lot of, obviously adds a lot of weight to social safeguards as well, but really they should be integral to any initiative. These communities, people across the tropics rely heavily on these ecosystems, and any restoration or conservation that happens will inherently have an impact on them and their livelihoods. So we need to think it's great to see the market demand in CCB, which Lauren highlighted so great in her presentation. But this really needs to be an integral part of all projects, not just some. Thanks, Matt. So just some of the potential way forwards to support the science, which has moved on a lot. And there are some really good kind of like blueprint projects now coming online. There's a lot that can be done with methodology kind of demystification. The Fair Carbon Initiative, which is just starting up now, is a really exciting potential for this. And to see some more default values, particularly related to soil organic carbon in the IPCC guidelines, would be really fantastic. Fully account for the impact, the carbon impact of wetlands conservation. Article 6 negotiations, we all know they are key, and they really are going to be key at COP26. Developing these projects can be seen as slightly risky. While these negotiations are still going on, how are they going to, how a carbon offset project is going to align with NDCs or support NDCs, and having some policy case studies as, as kind of best practices established will really help kind of confidence in the sector, and particularly from a project developer perspective going forward. And lastly, some other potential ideas as well. These systems are unique, particularly in the co-benefits that they provide, as Lauren was highlighting, and as did Matt. There are a lot of co-benefits. Do the current standards fully enable projects to highlight these co-benefits sufficiently? The $29 mentioned in the report, which Lauren referenced, as kind of like a feasibility at the minimum feasible price for carbon, I think is really, really relevant. These projects are often quite expensive. Conservation in general is expensive to do, but particularly from an opportunity cost perspective for coastal communities that are impacted by wetland conservation and restoration. So it would be really great to see either fixed pricing or true recognition of the financial value of these projects, and along with that as well, potentially some innovative finance as well, which is really exciting to hear more from Angelique about the excellent work that's going on in the Seychelles. And the last one, Matt, thanks. So it's really about, the focus has to be on minimizing risk and maximizing impact. We have to be ambitious if we're to meet the commitments necessary to make the Paris Agreement a reality, and what we as a globe has promised in that. So we have to be ambitious, and blue carbon ecosystems have a really key role in that. However, yeah, there's a lot to be done to kind of like de-risk these initiatives in order to really allow them to go to scale. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me today. I can be contacted at the email address, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Leah, for the very interesting presentation. It gave a totally new perspective into not just talking about ecosystems or the coastal habitats, but you also talked about integrating this with other cross-sector areas, such as fisheries management and so on, to ensure long-term perspective to that. And you've also given a very good overview on what should be some of the way forward suggestions on countries moving towards planning for their national and perhaps also regional initiatives concerning blue forest economy. With that, we have now completed all the presentations from the speakers, and we'll look at some of these questions. I'm aware that some of this has been answered, but we'll just go from the first one. There is a question from Kamal. Thank you, Kamal, for the question. What is the mechanism of collaborating with IORA? I think in terms of collaboration within IORA, I am from the Center for Marine Science and Technology from Sri Lanka. I believe this question, perhaps I'll pass it to Matt to take it up.
Yes, sure. And thanks for your question, Kamal. So the IORA Secretariat is based in Mauritius, and they have a website which is very useful, I encourage you, if you want to learn more about IORA, to look at the IORA website. You can Google it. And of course, I'll also note that Dr. Gatto and Shumimtaz from the IORA Secretariat are online and with us, and they will be able to respond to you as well. If you want to learn more about the Blue Carbon Hub specifically, then you can contact me. Just Google the IORA Blue Carbon Hub and follow the contact details in there, and we'll get back to you. But of course, the IORA is much broader than the work that the hub does, although this is one of the priority areas. Thanks for your question, Kamal.
Thank you, Matt, for taking that question. We have another question here. We've got some time. We can try to look at all these questions by order. This question is from Susanta from Sri Lanka as well. And the question, there's two parts to this question. What is the best model which could be used for calculation of co-benefits, specifically from seagrass? And the second question is possibility of reporting blue carbon in national communication, or NDCs. Perhaps, I think, if possible, can I pass this to Angelique and Leah to take this up?
Thanks. So just to maybe step back for a moment, with regards to for example, the example in the Seychelles, we are including this piece of work on seagrass within our adaptation section. And that's because there are certain steps we have to do in order to then be able to incorporate it into our carbon inventory. But we will be committing to put it in our carbon inventory from here on using the IPCC wetland supplement. But with regards, and because it sits within the sort of the adaptation section, we are looking at the co-benefits that it provides. And I think whilst I don't have, magic suggestions with calculations of co-benefits, we are looking at having ecosystem services valuations done. That is looking at fisheries, recreation and tourism. So these are ongoing pieces of work in the Seychelles at the moment. And that's hopefully will provide us with some data.
Thank you, Angelique. Leah, maybe because there's a specific point on seagrass, would you want to take that up?
Yes, happy to build on what Angelique has already said. So I'm not, there are various ways of calculating co-benefits from seagrass. I don't think there's any kind of like necessarily a best way. One suggestion I would have is to reference the Plan Vivo project in Kenya being developed in the Vanga region. You should hopefully be able to find some information on the Plan Vivo website related to that. And they're looking at, they're incorporating seagrass co-benefits into their carbon project. And hopefully there you should find some more information as far as like how they've done that to build on the carbon benefit that the project is delivering from mangrove conservation and restoration. So I think that's a really interesting case study that I'm really excited to see come online over the next year or so.
Thank you, Leah.
Thanks, Cheryl.
I hope that answers Susanta's question. We'll move to the next question that we have here. There are two questions basically from Hossein. Thank you, Hossein, for the questions. I'm just going to merge these two. He is from Iran, and he mentioned that there are 21,000 hectares of natural and about 11,000 of planted mangrove forests. He would like to know what is the next step after this webinar and how Iran can take part in this initiative. And then he also inquired more about the institutional and legal status of IORA. I think perhaps, Matt, this would be most suited for you to take up this question.
Thank you, Cheryl, and hello, Hussein. Thank you also for those questions. I'll defer the second question about the legal status of IORA, perhaps, if you could go to the IORA webpage and drop them a contact. They'll be able to help you out with that one. Far be it from me to talk about that. I am but a scientist, not a lawyer of any stretch. But I can tell you a little bit about the mangroves. I think certainly Iran has some great natural resources, including mangroves and seagrasses. So it's great to see that you've got some numbers against them. There's a few different actions that can be implemented around those. You will have heard some of my co-panelists talk about the Paris Agreement and NDCs. Certainly one very concrete step that can be implemented is by incorporating actions around mangrove protection and restoration into the NDCs. These are the nationally determined contributions that all of the 197 signatory parties to the Paris Agreement have committed to. So that I believe includes Iran. And there's ways that those actions can be implemented, but one of the simplest ways that it can be done is simply by following the IPCC guidelines for incorporating wetlands into national greenhouse gas inventories. So that's a relatively simple step, or at least it sounds simple. Of course, implementation is always a little bit more complex. If you want to know more about that, again, just drop me a line. I'll put my email address in the chat box, and feel free to send me a direct message that way.
Thank you, Matt. And perhaps, Matt, I'll just help you a little bit on the institutional legal status. I echo with Matt. Being from Malaysia, I believe the first thing is that it is an intergovernmental platform for cooperation among the member states. And there are some countries as well in the capacity of observer role. And there is a lot of opportunities for cooperation, and what we do is normally we communicate through our national focal points, and usually this would be the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the case of Malaysia. And there are a lot of avenues to bring in cooperative ideas and perspectives and potential projects and so on with other countries, including the mechanism to involve NGOs, other think tanks, research institutions, and so on. But I believe, Hussein, like mentioned, you probably get a bit more details from the IORA website. Let's move on to the next question for Rohani. Rohani is specifically referring to Seychelles as a good case example here. And I believe Rohani is from Indonesia. The question is how, she said the example from Seychelles is interesting in the sense that how they're able to get data on seagrass extension and then estimation of blue carbon within the area. She's also mentioning seagrass in area in Indonesia is very large, and potentially there's a lot of basically carbon stock potential. However, this information has not been quantified due to inaccurate data on seagrass extension in that area. So perhaps Angelique, is there any suggestion for area like this with a big potential of carbon stock but still unmanaged properly? Would you like to take that up?
Probably will defer to other panelists on this one. But just to say that to the point about not being able to measure and manage is definitely a challenge, because without getting a good understanding of what we have, it's particularly difficult to manage. But I defer to more of the blue carbon experts on the panel to perhaps have suggestions for Indonesia.
Thank you, Angelique. Any of the other panel, Lauren, Leah, would you want to take this up? The question on, estimation of potential carbon stock in large areas where there is basically data deficiency. I think that's, and then unmanaged properly. I think there's a management issues in large areas. How do we address those specifically?
So I've got the seagrass behind me. Maybe I'll make a little note about the seagrass mapping. But Rohani, hello, Rohani. It's a challenge, and you're absolutely right. For Indonesia, we don't have very good estimates of seagrass extent and seagrass extent. In fact, extent of any ecosystem is one of the fundamental bits of information needed to estimate not only its mitigation potential, but also to calculate that net balance between emissions and sequestration. Angelique mentioned the remote sensing, the satellite-based remote sensing that is being underway in Seychelles. That's the approach that we think is most helpful at the scale of a country. It does mean that there are some questions around how you use that when the sort of the bands that the satellites have don't penetrate through water that well. So it's a live question that the scientists and the remote sensors and the engineers are working on. But stay tuned.
Thank you, Matt. There is another question from Thomas. Specifically, I think it's addressed to Angelique. It's mentioned here, co-benefits for tourism needs to take into consideration the co-damages done by long-haul tourism to Indian Ocean destination. To what extent is this taken into consideration? I think it's a very specific question. Angelique.
Thanks, Thomas, for that question. It's a very important question, and obviously one that requires a lot of thought with regards to how tourism, although it's a main pillar of the Seychelles economy, it's also contributing drastically. And I forget the percentage that was announced at COP25, but it's also contributing towards making Seychelles more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change because of the emissions associated with this industry. With regards to the specific study underway, I don't have the answer for you with regards to whether co-damages are being taken into consideration in the evaluation, the ecosystem evaluation services evaluation, but I'm happy to find out and connect and share with you, and even take that to them if they haven't taken that into consideration. It is a study that's being undertaken by the Nature Conservancy, as well as funded by the Swallow Fish 3 project. So happy to look into that for you with regards to long haul travel. But yes, certainly a thorny issue, I should say, because it is a real conundrum for small islands to look at.
Thank you very much, Angelique. Thomas, we hope that answered your question. We'll move on. We've got a couple of minutes still for discussion, so let's move on. There's a question from Audrey. I think, again, this question is very much in reference to the case study in Seychelles and also in Madagascar. So the question is, there are lots of complementarity with community blue carbon initiatives with community fisheries management. In fact, some of the innovative structures, such as the Seychelles Blue Bond, can spur and support fisheries management. However, there are some conflicts. Are there examples of this that are being documented, and how are these conflicts being resolved?
Perhaps I'll take another stab at this one. So yes, I mean, absolutely. And the Blue Bond proceeds are definitely supporting fisheries management. And we've seen several small-scale fishers lead projects that are funded by the Blue Bond proceeds. I think the closest example yet, because we have not seen from the sort of the blue bond angle of things, we haven't seen a lot of conflicts arise. But this was a very live issue during the marine spatial planning process, which is when we had to identify the 30% marine protected area. And all minutes of the meetings of the marine spatial planning process have been documented, but I think it's also worth sharing the experience of resolving conflicts with the very many users of the EEZ of the Seychelles, and how it was there were trade-offs that needed to be done between conservationists, fisheries, and fisheries of all scale, small scale as well as industrial. And I think the one thing that's particularly poignant is often there are groups of people who can spend their time in these consultative processes that are workshop sessions, right? And it's okay for us to sit down and spend a day discussing and identifying the compromises and so on. Unfortunately, for a group of people like small scale fishers, they're losing a day's worth of work. And as such, the approach that was taken by the Marine Spatial Planning Initiative and their core team is really to move away from just the workshop approach to move to one-to-one engagement, but also have all of those documented and bringing the views of the small-scale fishers to sort of plenary to be able to take their views into consideration. But it must be said, there were trade-offs. But one thing that was apparent is you didn't have to be the loudest in the room in order for your views to be heard. It was a very consultative process. So I'll give that as one example that I anticipate now that we see more of the implementation of the Marine Spatial Plan itself, more projects realized through the proceeds of the Blue Bond. We are looking as to how to keep this consultative unit and conversation about conservation ongoing as we implement the Marine Spatial Plan.
Excellent. Thank you, Angelique. Leah, would you want to provide some insights to this?
Yeah, no, I think that was what Angelique said was really fantastic. It's really interesting to hear about the learning and lessons that are coming out of the great work that's been done in the Seychelles. I think it's very interesting as well, the difference between the different blue carbon ecosystems, whether they're mangroves or seagrass are being the focus. What do blue carbon initiatives do? They either protect or restore. And what impact are those activities going to do to have on, I guess is the question. When it comes to mangrove initiatives, they normally have a perceived negative impact on forest users rather than fishers. In fact, regenerated mangroves are seen by the fishers that we work with in Madagascar as a real positive, in the fact that they provide an important nursery, and we're really the research is ongoing, but we're trying to monitor the impact of mangrove conservation on the small scale fisheries that they support. But seagrass is definitely more complicated because often the actions, particularly for seagrass conservation, will impact both small scale and industrial scale fishers and larger fishing groups as well. So yeah, just really to reiterate the importance of that participatory process, full consultation, listening and understanding the root causes and the potential costs, and ensuring that any activities that the carbon finance support goes towards offsetting any of those costs borne by fishers. But it's really complex, and it was a great question, and we definitely need more documentation related to this issue.
Thank you very much, Leah. Thank you, Aubrey, again for the very interesting question. We'll move on. Hi, Antusi. Good to see you here. I believe, Lauren, you've addressed most of the questions towards you in the function itself. So we'll move on to Guanqing. Hi, Guanqing. The question is, what's the difference between blue forest and blue carbon ecosystem in the policy and financing mechanism? I'll just open it to all the panels. If any of you would want to take this up.
Well, perhaps since I mentioned blue forest, I'll take it. Thanks, Guanqing. Essentially, there is no difference. They're the same thing. When we were working during the think tank at the initial workshop, it was a term. Blue forest was a term that was coined by Stephen Lutz, and we thought that it was an evocative term that we could use in the same way that blue carbon is kind of taken off as a way of describing what's essentially sort of muddy brown stuff. But it sort of sounds great when we say blue carbon. So in the same way that we can call mangroves blue forests and seagrasses blue meadows. But they're the same thing. And while I have the floor there and we're talking about that workshop, I should have a bit of an acknowledgement to Torsten Thiele, who's been online and who is not only an important contributor to the workshop, but had a lot of contributions to the sorts of content in the talk that I gave today. And by the way, Angelique, the seagrasses behind me are Seychelles seagrass, and I put it up because it is so beautiful.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much, Guanqing, for the question. Well, Angelique, I think Thomas is just responding back saying there is definitely an opportunity to further explore the idea I posed earlier. Okay, there's a question from Derek. Simple, straightforward. Are there capacity development opportunities for early career scientists? I think he's talking about maybe trainings and so on. Well, Matt, you want to briefly take this up?
Well, I'll have the first go, and then I'll throw to my three co-panelists who probably can make other suggestions. We have some. We do run regular fellowships as part of the Blue Carbon Hub. We have been slowed down because of travel restrictions related to COVID. We are looking forward to getting started again. This webinar is one of the sort of the tools that we've used to try and combat that. But there are others around, and I'm sure that my three co-panelists are aware of some of them, so I'll open it to them perhaps, Cheryl, if that's all right.
Thank you, Matt. Any of the other panelists would like to respond to opportunities? Oh, we're good. Okay, and well, actually time's up, but we'll just take one more here. Susanta, question from Susanta: as some seagrass are seasonal, and how it could be impacted for carbon financing, I would like to get an answer from a practical perspective. Yep, it's on seagrass again.
On seagrass, I can say that a lot of what we're thinking about is below ground. The carbon is stored below ground, and so the seasonal aspect of the biomass above ground is much less important. Lauren, I don't think there's any, in terms of the mechanisms to recognise carbon sequestration, there's any particular relevance to the seasonality that I'm aware of. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think essentially the seasonality element would need to be addressed through the methodology that's used. So it wouldn't, it should be addressed through that mechanism, but then it shouldn't affect, flow of funds and the ability to secure carbon revenue, as long as those seasonality and fluctuations are accounted for through the methodology. I don't know exactly how existing methodologies or those under development do that in detail, but I think that's how it would be dealt with.
All right, so I think that's about it. Yeah, and we're at the end of the webinar today. Matt, if I can just quickly say thank you very much for this opportunity once again. It's been a very exciting experience for me, as well as to learn from all of you on this very important aspect on blue forest economy and financing, especially in the Indian Ocean region. I would not attempt to try to summarize this. I think there's still there's so much done, and yet there's so much more to be done, especially in the IORA region, because we're talking about most of the countries that are still very much developing and building their baselines and looking at all these different conservation challenges, development challenges, financial challenges, policy challenges, and so on. So I think this has been definitely a very good initiative to discuss some of these aspects, and there's a lot of opportunity like this to share experience and to further work together on addressing some of these major barriers and challenges that we're talking about, especially on the financing aspects. With that, Matt, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you for your excellent moderation today. I think I can summarize it in probably 30 seconds. And that Lauren started off talking about the sort of the appetite that's out there and the barriers to that. And then Leah talked about it as an adventure. I liked that, thinking about, you know, how we get through those barriers is an adventure. And then Angelique gave an evocative kind of image that I'll probably walk away with, and thinking about the in terms of the adventure and the suite of options that we have to try and work through it. She called it a buffet. I thought that was pretty good. So with that, I want to thank everybody, thank especially all my co-panelists. Thank you, Cheryl, for some excellent moderation, and thank you for everyone for attending today. Bye now.